All right, so this is day 3 of the review, and last time we stopped at the edge of imperialism when America was really expanding and getting involved in all these different countries, and we've moved really far away from the time when we were isolationists. We've got Guam and the Philippines and Alaska. We're not just the 49 contiguous states anymore. George Washington, in his farewell address, warned us against getting entangled with Europe because Europe, for centuries, has been fighting over land and terror. It just gets involved in these wars, and Washington didn't want us to get involved in those. So we definitely still have the wisdom of Washington running through our minds as we head into World War One. Our first instinct is, okay, yes, we are trading and we're benefiting from that trade. We trade with Great Britain, we trade with Germany, and Spain. But our first instinct is this is a European war. And it was a European war, okay? So you have to first understand, well, why did World War One happen? These are things that are happening in Europe that have nothing to do with America, okay? There is a buildup in Europe of the military, militarism. And these are sort of out of order because I'm doing them in the order so that you can remember their main reasons. MAIN, militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism. So we're going to go through them. But this is why the war happened in Europe. So European countries are building up their military. It's an arms race, okay? Germany sees that France is building a military, and they're like, oh, France might attack me, gotta build up my military. France now sees Germany building theirs, so France builds theirs, Germany, back and forth, and every country is starting to build up their military. Alliances. Now, these alliances are done in secret, okay? So nobody knows who's on what side, what if one party declares war, who's going to be drug in. There's the Triple Entente, which is France, Great Britain, and Russia, okay? And you're going to have alliances in World War II, so please make sure you can remember, okay, World War I, Triple Entente, and the Triple Alliance, which is Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. That's World War I. So if France goes to war with, let's say, Germany, then that means that Great Britain and Russia are also going to go to war, okay? But nobody knows it. It's all in secret. So these alliances make Europe a very delicate place. Again, European problem, not ours. You don't see us on that list, right? Imperialism. This is why you have to do history in order, right? This goes back to, remember, colonialism, establishing colonies all the way back in lesson 1. Europe still does that, okay? Larger countries still believe that the way to gain wealth is through establishing colonies. And Great Britain at the time was called the kingdom that never sleeps because when the sun set on one colony, it would be rising in the other. They had colonies from one edge of the world to the other. And they're going to exert control over their colonies. Now, this might be some country in Africa, and maybe they don't want to be underneath the control of Great Britain, and that's going to cause some problems. Nationalism, this idea that these smaller countries inside of this huge imperialistic nations, they're starting to feel like, well, you know what, we can govern ourselves, right? We don't need to be underneath the protection of the mother country that doesn't really look out for our best interests anyways. You can see this in the Middle East and in Africa as these countries start breaking away. Serbia, Austria-Hungary, all these different nationalities are going to start exerting themselves during this period. And all of this is just creating a powder keg, okay? And that's, you might see that term. Historians use sort of the same terms over and over again. And during World War I, the term powder keg comes up over and over again because all of these things were building up, and all it needed was a spark to light everything on fire. And that spark was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. When he was assassinated, it pulled all these countries into war. These countries had lots of militaries. They started using them, and it was the start of World War One. So this slide I pulled just so you could get an idea of the major players, right? This is Europe. Blue is your Triple Entente, France, Great Britain, and Russia. They are going to have all sorts of colonies. So the bottom shows colonies so that you can get an idea of what that looks like. In 1914, you can see that Great Britain was spread out across the world. So the military, during World War I, we're going to come in contact with a huge array of new weapons. Remember, this is a period of industrialization, so we're using it for good, for railroads and electricity and all that stuff. But now that we're in war, that same idea is going to be used to produce new weapons. We're going to see the introduction of the airplane and the tank and the machine gun and the submarine. It's going to develop something called trench warfare, which was horrific, where you basically just dug trenches. You had a huge stretch of no man's land. The other side dug trenches, and you just fired at each other. And periodically, they'd be like, okay, ready, man, charge. And you would just charge, and they would just machine gun you down. Sometimes in between these no man's lands, you'd have barbed wire. So as you're charging, you're not only being shot at, but you're getting hung up in this barbed wire. Gas. Some of the weapons in World War I were considered inhumane. You're going to use things like gas that they would throw into the trenches, and so they would use gas masks to try to protect against that. World War I was particularly gruesome in its weapons. So all of that is going on in Europe, right? So America has this isolationist attitude. I like to think of it like a turtle, okay? Prior to World War I, we took our legs out, we stuck our head out, and we started getting involved, and especially in trade, acquired a few territories. But now war breaks out, and we're like, whoop, George Washington was right, inside of our shell, isolationists. We're going to try to remain neutral, especially before some of our ships get bombed by submarines, okay? We're going to try to trade with both countries. But the other countries are saying, hey, you know what? That's not fair. You're supplying food and supplies, and we have a blockade going on. So you need to know, well, what does bring us into the war? The three main reasons that we enter World War I are going to be Germany is going to do something called unrestricted submarine warfare. Okay? Before, they would say, okay, this is a French ship, we'll bomb that one, we're going to leave American ships alone, that sort of thing. But now they're like, you know what? No, it doesn't matter. American ship, you're got supplies, and you might be just giving them food, but there could be guns smuggled aboard. Unrestricted submarine warfare. Of course, the most famous bombing is the Lusitania that carried a lot of passengers. The second thing that pulls us into the war is going to be something called the Zimmerman Note. The Zimmerman Note is kind of interesting. It was intercepted between Germany and Mexico. And at this point, Mexico is not terribly involved. But Germany says, you know what? This war is going to spread. America is eventually going to get involved. America doesn't know that. Like we're like, no, we're not going to get involved. But Germany's saying, you know what? America will eventually get involved. So Mexico, if you join Germany's side, when America pulls in, we're going to win, and we'll give you back all that territory that you lost in the Mexican War. California, all that stuff. California, Nevada, Arizona. Whew, my mind's going crazy. So the Zimmerman Note was a sort of a wake-up call to America to be like, well, okay, this war might actually come to our coast, and we should be paying attention. And with that note, we realized we can't just sit on the sidelines. Wilson has to go to Congress to get a declaration of war, because remember, Congress is the one that declares war. And he says, you know what? Europe is becoming overrun by autocrats, and it is America's responsibility to get involved to protect democracy. If we do not protect democracy, we're going to be the only country left, and that's not a good position to be in. So these are the three reasons that sort of propel us. You need to know what's going on the home front. Home front being in America, what are we doing to support the war effort? Because it was an all-out war. Hundreds of men, thousands of men are going to go to Europe and fight and die, but that doesn't mean that things at home just stop, right? It means they change, and we start preparing for war by growing victory gardens so that we can conserve food so that more food can go to Europe. There's a huge increase in taxes. I think at one point there's like an 80% tax. You could buy war bonds, basically meaning that you bought these bonds and then the government would pay you back. The government needed money. They needed money to make planes and ammunition and food. So it was definitely a total war in that the Americans at home felt it. They might not have been fighting on our shores, but we definitely saw sacrifice at home. So we did win, obviously. The War of 19th. To end the war, there was a treaty, and that was the Treaty of Versailles. This treaty is going to be very harsh, especially on Germany, because Europe saw Germany as the ones that started it, and they're going to attach something called the War Guilt Clause, saying they had to take complete responsibility. Reparations. Reparations are money paid by a country. These reparations were outlandishly high. There was no way that Germany was going to be able to pay them back, especially since a lot of the fighting had been done in Germany, so they were demolished. So how can you pay someone back when you're trying to recover and rebuild? So it was unrealistic. It took away land from Germany, took away their military. So America did come into the war, and so we wanted to have a part in the peace process. Now Wilson is president, and he advocates for his 14 points. And his 14 points go back to those main things that caused the war: secret alliances, militarism, nationalism, and imperialism. So when you look at the 14 points, you can see a direct tie. He wanted no secret treaties. He wanted freedom of the seas. He wanted more free trade. He wanted a reduction in arms. He didn't want colonialism. People stopped, no more of this going over and taking colonies. Wilson's baby, what he really wanted, and he just struggled and advocated for and campaigned for. Wilson's baby was the League of Nations. The League of Nations was when all the countries would come together and they would work things out. Okay, he saw it as if countries could just come to the table and talk about things, then they wouldn't fight, right? Diplomacy over shooting, right? Well, he's going to be sorely disappointed. He does not get it, right? America does not join the League of Nations, and a lot of people say that's why it failed, because America didn't join. But America saw that as being too entangling, right? We get joined in the League of Nations, and France and Germany decide to go to war. Well, then all of a sudden America's, we're in the mix. We want to be able to determine if we should go to war just based on us, okay? Again, that isolationist attitude of if it doesn't directly affect us, we don't want to have to be drug in. Okay, we're not ready to be involved in European affairs completely yet. So that's World War I. Now, the war is over. The men are coming home. Here's why it's important to know that there was sacrifices and sacrifices being made at home, was because after the war, when people start coming home, they're ready to start living again, right? Their men are home, they're making money, all of that assembly line and production that was going into making planes and guns and bullets is suddenly being made for home goods, and they're ready to live life, okay? And so after the war, you get this boom, and it's called the Roaring Twenties. There's going to be a laissez-faire economic policy where the government says, you know what, hands off. We're not going to get involved in business. Business can just do what it wants. No government regulations. and these businesses just start to thrive. The automobile is going to start be using the assembly line, so it's going to become available not just to the rich as like a toy, but everybody. Okay, and think about all the things that are associated with the car. Suddenly, you're in any gas station, so you're in any job. There's a whole new market. Tourism, people can travel and go see New York or to the next city over. That's going to mean you need restaurants. You're going to have a migration from cities. Suddenly, you don't have to work in the city to get to your job. You can have a car and live further out. So urban areas are going to start developing. So think about the industries during the 20s that are going to start coming about, which provide jobs and more money and more production. The automobile, electricity, the radio, movies. This is the area of mass consumption, okay? And people are living the high life. But it's not equal distribution, right? People who live in the cities, white, upper class males, are going to be doing much better than farmers. Farmers are actually going to be hit hard because they were producing a lot of food to be shipped overseas to the war effort. Now that they do not need to ship that food over there, they're seeing a recession. And of course, African Americans are being discriminated against, so they don't see this as equally either. So I put my turtle up here because after the war, America is going to enter into a period of isolationism again, where we didn't join the League of Nations. The 1920s, when you're going to see things like prohibition, because not only is there an attitude of buy, and live on the high life, but it's a conflict between conservative, socially conservative, and this sort of new liberal movement. Socially conservative people are saying, drinking is causing family issues, and we should stop drinking. So they were able to pass the 18th Amendment, which prohibited alcohol. And you couldn't buy or sell alcohol. Well, of course, that didn't go over very well. And then you had speakeasies and illegal bars. So eventually it was repealed with the 21st Amendment. Women's suffrage, so women are seeing a lot of social advancements. They're getting washing machines and all these things that are allowing them more free time, but they're not seeing equality, right? They're not allowed to go and be doctors. They're not allowed to go into the universities and get the same education. And then if they do manage to get jobs as a secretary or whatever, they're not getting the same pay as men. And of course, the big thing is the right to vote. So there's a social push there. They do get the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. Flappers are those social highlight, the sort of symbol of the 1920s where women cut their hair and smoked and wore short skirts, sort of saying, we're here and we can sort of do the same things as men. The Scopes trial, this is when there was a push towards teaching evolution in public schools, because up until this, it had just been accepted that creationism would be taught. And so that was the big trial, the Scopes trial, or the monkey trial. So how did we go from the 1920s roaring when everybody's just got it going and then life is good, to the Great Depression, where there's food lines and people are starving? And that's why I really like this picture, because it shows, okay, this is what it was like after the war. There's no way like the American way. And you've got like the picture perfect family and the dog and the car and the world's highest standard of living. This is a bread line. These people are waiting in line for bread. And especially in this particular picture, it's mostly African Americans. Again, it shows that disparity. So now we're going to talk about how we got there, how we got from the 1920s to the Great Depression. The course talks about it like a snowball effect, right? Overproduction, right? They're producing way too much, and they're not buying with money, they're buying on credit. And so as people start not paying their creditors back, there's not as much production going on, right? So companies start slowing down their production because the demand is not there. So you start seeing sort of a slow off in buying because they're reaching their maximum amount of credit, right? So they can't take out any more credit. Maybe they're failing on their credit or their payments. So buying is starting to slow. So when buying slows, producers stop making products. When people stop making products, they start laying people off. Well, that doesn't help with the payment issue, right? So now you don't have a job, so now you can't make your payments. It's even harder, which slows production, which causes them to lay off more people. Banks stop lending money. And so again, people can't go out and make any more innovations because the banks aren't lending you money to go start your small business. In the 1920s, it was even worse because banks actually ran out of money and there was a panic and there was a run on the banks. So it just all sorts starts out small and then gets bigger and bigger and snowballs effects. So causes, buying on credit, right? We buy on credit all the time, right? We're probably maybe you have a credit card, but this was something new. This idea of you didn't have to save your entire life to get something. The car, right? Imagine if you had to save your whole life to buy a car. So that's why people started buying on credit. Radios were bought on credit. Washing machines were bought on credit. But unfortunately, everybody started overextending themselves and they couldn't pay it back. During the 1920s, since everything was booming, the stock market was going up. And the fastest way to get rich was to invest in the ever-growing stock market. It was said that at some point, like 80% of Americans had investment in the stock market. But they were doing it on credit, right? They'd go to a stock market broker and say, hey, I want to buy this and I'm a stock. And he'd say, sure, here's money to buy this stock. But you have to pay me back with interest. Well, that's fine because the stock market's going up. So you buy it on Monday, you sell it on Friday, you've made your interest, you can pay back your loan for the stock. So what happens when the stock market starts to fall? People can't pay those loans back. All those loans get called and nobody can pay them back. Another cause is uneven distribution of wealth. The rich were getting really rich and the poor were getting a little bit more rich. So there's a big disparity in income. Of course, the Dust Bowl, farmers were overproducing and they were not taking good care of their land or agricultural processes, and so then you had the Dust Bowl called the banks collapse, and then you had the tariffs imposed by Hoover, which did not help at all. We're heading into Christmas, so I thought these were interesting pictures. This is a picture of during the Depression of unemployed men sitting with their little Christmas tree. The right picture is the bread lines, Christmas bread lines, 1931. So the Dust Bowl. Crops are literally going to turn to dust. Your homes are going to be buried. The South actually declares a state of emergency. You're going to have migration. Farmers realize that farming is hopeless, so they just walk away from their farms and head to the city. Of course, the cities are already overpopulated. People are stressed for jobs there, so they really didn't find anything there. In Oklahoma, there's actually a name for farmers who left Oklahoma migrating to cities. They were called the Okies. So to get out of the Great Depression, we're going to have Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. FDR and his New Deal. He had 3 R's. He had the relief, recovery, and reform. And the idea is that the government has to get involved. It has to actively work to get the economy back on track and people back to work. And Hoover, the previous president, his idea was the exact opposite, was that the economy will take care of itself. He had sort of more of a hands-off approach. Remember those cities, in cardboard cities, they were named Hoovervilles because people just detested his lack of involvement. So when FDR comes into the presidency, he's given basically a mandate to use the government to get things back. And he's going to start establishing programs. I like to call them, or lots of people like to call them, alphabet soup, because they all have initials. NRA, the National Recovery Act. This is when the government and businesses actively work together to figure out how to get us out of the Depression. They start setting price controls and minimum wages, price ceilings. So government and business working together. The AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, is going to get into those Dust Bowl areas, start looking at, well, how can we get farmers back on track? We'll give you money to grow X, Y, and Z. Giving states direct money through the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, where they give the states and say, okay, here's federal money to help your state do what it needs to do to get out of the Great Depression. The Civilian Conservation Corps is where it gave unemployed men, outdoor jobs, doing like improving roads, going into rural areas, putting up electrical things. These are all government-funded government jobs. Social Security. One of the problems during the Great Depression was that the elderly and the disabled had no backup. They didn't have any sort of savings. So this is sort of a mandated savings. They established Social Security, which of course we use now. If you're over the age of 60, you can start drawing out money that you are forced to put in by the government. The U.S. Housing Authority is where they went into these slum areas and started establishing housing that was safe and clean and federal housing. So make sure that you realize what the New Deal was, what some of the programs were, and what its goal was to get us out of the Great Depression. We're going to stop with the Great Depression, because after the Great Depression comes World War II. And World War II is what really lifts us out of the Great Depression, because what do you have to do when you go to war? You have to ramp up production. You've got to start building tanks and bullets and uniforms and sending food back overseas so farmers have a place in a market for their food. So while the New Deal did help, it's often seen as not what actually pulled us out of the Great Depression. World War II is seen as being what really ramped up and got production going again. And we will look at World War II in the next review.